So at first glance this was a movie that reminded me of Passengers, which was rather fairly critiqued by a lot of people, but I still liked it. So naturally this one piqued my interest, and it was also made by Neil Berger too, which further piqued my interest. Because he's made some pretty good movies in the past, like The Illusionist and Limitless. Now it turns out that the comparison to Passengers pretty much just stays at a very surface level. Because this is actually quite a different movie, even though they do share some concepts. And I'll be giving a quick synopsis of what's going on in this movie, and it might sound like a lot more than I usually reveal, but it's actually all just set up. Things the movie rushes through in the first couple of minutes to get the story going and to get to the rest of it. But the idea is that Earth is in trouble, there's drought and famine and whatnot going on. So we find another suitable planet to colonize, and of course it's rather far away. So we have to send a generational ship that will take the better part of a century to get there. Now, instead of putting people into cryosleep, we're gonna have to have generations of actual human beings living on the ship instead. And a seemingly clever way of doing that is by breeding the first generation on Earth, specifically for the task, and they'll all be essentially grown up in a lab in a very sterile and controlled environment. So they're used to living like that, and so they won't miss life on Earth and go crazy up there. Which I guess does make some amount of sense, and I was on board so far. And as I said, that's all just basic quick setup. Then we jump 10 years into the future and get to check in on life on the ship. That's where the actual movie starts, and I'm not gonna go into much detail about the rest. But certain things are revealed. There's a protocol they're following that actually made a lot of sense to me. And even a lot of the events that subsequently transpired made sense to me. It didn't feel like something too crazy, something over-exaggerated that couldn't possibly happen. Instead it felt like one of the potential problems with a plan like this. Which is probably why I don't think anyone would actually go through with an idea like this. There are too many flaws. But if anything, I have a problem with the logic of the plan on a very basic level. Not the actual events that took place in the story, because a lot of them did feel more or less inevitable, I guess, especially considering the circumstances. Now with that being said, I do think things sorta do eventually spiral into kind of ridiculous territory and start to step into the realm of absurdity, but it took a while to get there. So for the most part I didn't really even have that many issues with the core of the story. I definitely didn't love it, but it just made enough sense to keep me on board. Now where the actual problems start is, well, more or less with everything else, because all the characters are boring and completely uninteresting. Colin Farrell as the sort of mentor guy keeping everyone in line is literally the only one even remotely compelling. And that's a huge problem, but it's far from the only problem, because as I said, the story eventually starts getting more and more ridiculous to the point that it actually lost me. But I also didn't find the whole arc or anything about the writing to be very interesting. And on top of all of that, I wasn't really a fan of the filmmaking in general either. I didn't like the sound design, the mix of it felt a bit weird, and that's rarely a problem I encounter. But more noticeably, I didn't even like the direction here, it just felt messy. Which was further enhanced by some really strange editing, and together they just made this feel like complete amateur hour. Not to mention the production design that just felt very boring and uninspired. So at the end of the day, I really didn't like much about this at all, to be honest. And I'm actually really struggling to justify giving this more than a low 4. And if I wasn't on board with the actual logic of most of the events that took place, if that part didn't make enough sense to me to go along with, this would have been one of the worst movies I've seen in a long time. I mean, it still kinda is actually, but at least it had that redeeming part to it going for it, I guess. And no, I definitely wouldn't recommend it. It's just boring, shallow, and poorly put together. So you can probably skip this one, or don't, but you should. However, I'm still not your dad. Or lab sample donor for that matter. But hey, what are your thoughts on this? Have you seen it? Did you like it? Let me know. And if you enjoyed the video, maybe give it a thumbs up or sub to the channel because that would be fantastic.